Hello there. Hello, everyone. Sorry. Welcome back to another edition of Plant Consciousness Commentary. It's me, Tigre Gardenia, your nature-inspired mentor and certified life coach. More importantly, actually, for this case, is the fact that I am considered a world ambassador for plant intelligence. And look, I put an equal sign in there. Look, it's been a really interesting day, to say the least, and, I'm really actually excited to be here. Um yeah, there's just so much going on right now. So if you're new around here, welcome, welcome, welcome. I'd love to hear where you're coming in from. I'd love to hear, how you found us even. That's also something exciting always to find out. How is it that you heard? So this is Plant Consciousness Commentary. Every Friday, every week, I come to you with a paper, an article, a study about the wondrous minds of plants. And so I look and I scour the web for everything I can find in all the academic journals that I can get myself into, relating to plant intelligence, plant neurobiology, critical plant studies, plant humanities, really all about the human plant relationship. And what I do here more than anything is to try to break them down to make them understandable for the day to day for all of us, right? Especially, there are some really interesting studies happening right now and lots of experimentation around the human plant connection and the co creation through the arts, as well as there is more spirituality also coming into the academic world. And so bringing all of the plant knowledge that exists, including some of the arguing around things like plant intelligence, plant cognition, plant consciousness, where there's lots of debates going back and forth, but understanding what those debates are and how it is that they apply to your day-to-day life, or more importantly, to your relationships with the plants that you do spend time with and the plants that you have been able to collaborate with. And this week, actually, for me, has been extremely exciting from the perspective of acquiring new pieces of knowledge. Throughout my studies and my work, I always have this, I get really excited. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I get really excited to discover new pieces, or those, little pieces of knowledge that you maybe find in an unexpected place that just links things together and makes things much more clear to understand. And probably brings to light aspects of yourself that you had already felt and that you already knew. I had a fantastic interview with Julia Matera for the next episode of the pot. Not the next, because the next episode is actually all about chickweed and cattail, which was super exciting and interesting, and like one of those things that Kin just came in and said, us, we want to talk right now. But also there has been new developments in more of the arts and the co-creation perspective with plants, and I'm meeting some really interesting artists that are working very closely with plants in new and unusual ways. So I'm really excited. I'm kind of babbling this morning. I don't know why. I actually have a lot of clarity in my mind, but for some reason, you know how it is, the whole words thing. You know how I struggle with the whole words thing. So since I'm going to struggle with the words things, I'm just going to jump right into the paper that we have today. This is something that I found in an unusual place. There's kind of, when I go looking, I have a dedicated time every week that I go looking for what are the latest papers, what's going on in the critical plant studies and plant humanities. And like I said, I kind of go from the traditional to the non-traditional, and which makes it hard because sometimes I hit a lot of papers that are very technical in nature, like about how plants, I don't know, create volatile chemicals, and how plants do digestion, or metabolization is a better way of saying it. And so I always have to evaluate those. I don't like to read them too much in depth before I come to you, because I want it to be something that we do together, that you understand also how you yourself can explore these topics. How do you come about them, and how do you work with them? So I try really hard not to kind of get too far into the paper. And at the same time, I want to make sure that it's a paper that is adept or interesting for what it is that we have, that we are doing. So yeah, so I spend a lot of time with it. And this is one of those papers that I at first I kind of was like, I don't know. What is this really about? And then I just read a few little things about it and I was like, oh yeah, this is a good one. This I hope is going to be a good one for us to go through. So the paper is called, let me cue it up for you here. It always takes me a minute. Actually, I'm going to use this one and I have to set it up. Hold on. I'm still kind of getting used to the idea of exactly what is the, see, I always click like 4 or 5 different things as I'm preparing everything. I always want to find the right view. Let's try full screen mode. Does that work? See, but then it gives, oh yeah, it does allow me. Okay, great. See, so this is a paper from Anthropology Southern Africa. And I love this because one of the things that I very much enjoy in this work that we're doing and in this commentary is the fact that I have been reviewing papers, analyzing papers from a wide breadth, like from different countries, from different academic backgrounds. And that diversity is extremely nourishing because the beauty is that then we get to integrate the different aspects that come from all of these places. So this is like, Anthropology Southern Africa, which of course is going to have a different slant, I hope, than what we're seeing in some of the more Western countries, especially. So I tend to try to jump around as much as possible between, there's a lot going on in Australia, there's a lot going on obviously in the US, but there's also in Canada, and then distinct parts of Europe. We did an Italian paper last week, and we came across some of the cultural norms embodied into that paper. So I really look for papers that give us an opportunity to get a wide breadth of understanding, because I think if we're going to create our own new rituals and linguistics and paradigms and vocabularies around the human-plant connection, it's extremely important for us to get a broad view from plants that are speaking to humans in many different ways. And so if we just had one geographical area, I just don't think we would get the true picture that is necessary for plants. I'm just keeping an eye on my internet connection because it looks like my internet connection is actually a little wonky right now. So if you're having problems seeing me, please let me know in the comments. And of course, throughout this entire discussion, please feel free to put whatever it is that your thoughts are, what you're thinking about, what I'm talking about into the comments. If you're watching the replay, I will include the timestamps in order, which reminds me, last time I struggled a little bit with the timestamps because I forgot to write them. So, it's just, all these little details that as I do this more often, I get better at, but it just takes a minute. So I do also include a full, breakdown of the show notes and what's important and what we talked about and things like that. So, okay. This is a paper by William Ellis. As you can read, it says plant knowledge transfers, shaping, and states in plant practices. And I want to read, I'm excited to read the, let me just make sure I get this as big as possible. Nope, too much. Okay, this is it. And let me just make myself a little bit smaller so that we can, I don't know if that made it any different. I think this is fine for now. You let me know if you have a problem. So this William Ellis is from the Department of Anthropology and Sociology and the Center for Humanities Research at the University of Western Cape. So this is in South Africa. And I'm excited because anthropology and sociology, when I was first going to college, I actually thought I was going to go into a branch of sociology. I was studying psychology and philosophy and a minor in philosophy, psychology, and a minor in sociology. That's what my first declared major that I ever had. Then I switched and I went to music engineering. That's a long story and a really interesting one, but not for this time right now. But because I was thinking of going into law and I really wanted to understand. The interesting part is that my master's degree, which is a master's in vegetal future, futuro vegetale, is actually in the School of Architecture, and the two professors that were the ones that conceptualized this entire master's degree was Stefano Mancuso, that we hear talk about a lot because Stefano Mancuso is a very well-known figure in the world of plant neurobiology, actually one of the founding members of plant neurobiology, and from one of those voices that's really pushing for the recognition of consciousness of plants. And then the other side of it was Leonardo Chiesi. And Leonardo Chiesi, who teaches both at the University of Florence, where I did my master's, but also at Berkeley, is a professor of sociology in the built environment, in architecture. So actually, my master's, which is social innovation, it's plants, social innovation design, is actually very focused on sociology and design in the built environment as much as it pushes for social innovation connected to plants. So you know how it is. When something is important to you, it's important to you. So I'm excited to be doing a paper that is connected to anthropology and sociology again, because anthropology is definitely something I'm dipping my toes into, kind of really moving into plant anthropology, if anything, because that's what because that's just how it is. Anyway, so here we go. We're going to start off the paper. I'm just writing the time. 11. Okay, so this exploratory paper interrogates the various ways in which knowledge about plants has historically been generated. It first examines how plant knowledge is located in and understood by traditional studies of plants, such as ethnobotany. It pushes at the accepted boundaries of plant studies, where related concepts like Anthropocene and planetary challenge the certainties felt in ethnobotanical and other plant studies. It thus contributes to a growing body of work that wants to examine the imponderabilia of plant life. Second, the paper questions the orthodoxies concerning knowledge transfer and suggests an alternative set of transfer lines. The paper shows that this was my excited line. This is the line that really grabbed my attention. The paper shows that practitioners do not consider the acquisition and production of plant knowledge as simply an intellectual matter or one of mere curiosity, but rather as requiring particular bodily and psychic states that enable access to deeper and hidden plant knowledge. Isn't that exciting that this is in a paper that's talking about this? I get so excited when we see this because it is true. For many of us, yes, we're curious, but it's more about the relationship, and therefore it does open up to other channels of ourselves in order to connect and communicate with plants. And that is where that knowledge base comes from. Today, I was going back through some old editorials connected to Falco, the spiritual teacher of Damanhur, and I came across so many interesting things that he said about plantness, about really understanding the contact and the connection to the plant world and why it is so important to us. And as I was going through those, I was realizing just how much like the spiritual, the artistic, and the academic or the scientific is starting to come together, which to me is super, super, super exciting. Okay. So these states are known to plants, and they can choose to reveal them to plant practitioners or not. The paper closes with the argument that plant blindness holds the key to reading the magical properties of plants and, in part, suggests their occult and esoteric uses and agentivity. I love this. I love this already. I love it. All right. So the question is, how do we know plants? Right? That's how do we know? I have over the last few years become preoccupied with the question of how humans gather knowledge about plants. I'm just preoccupied with the knowledge that plants give us. Like completely preoccupied with that. The knowledge question in the various disciplines that investigate plant life and its relations to other beings is varied and largely contingent on a set of epistemological assumptions that are often culturally specific. Epistemological and culturally are understood to be related to the production and conceptualization of knowledge in very distinct ways. I like that this person actually defined it, because we read many papers together, right? We read tons of them, and epistemological, ontological comes out all the time. Anybody who works in academia throws those out. I even had an interview with I did a very small interview, or more like a chat, with an artist who seems to be working in a very kind of, secular area. And because he had done his master's studies connected to plants and art, He was just all ontological, and I was like, "Oh my goodness, relax." So I'm glad that they actually defined it. Viveiros de Castro defines what many of us see as culture as indigenous reason, as in response to its own individual set of logical indigenous problematics. He includes in the formulation sorry, I forgot that it does this. I have to remember that. Western epistemologies like science. This paper adopts a very open and radically coeval, borrowed from Viveiros de Castro's work, approach to indigenous reason to analyze knowledge production, transfers, and creation of several ethnographic settings I worked in. I draw on my investigations among Rastafarians in the Western Cape during the late 1990s. I think I'm already in love with this paper. I'm just hoping it's as good as it seems like it is. And more recently in the Namaqualand, hope I said that right, Namaqualand between 2014 and 2016. I also refer to research I conducted with traditional healer Gogo Mokete from 1998 to 1999. The paper is also informed by fieldwork in the municipality of Matsikama, Western Cape Province, and by a photo voice exercise with children living on farms in Kisi Valley outside Montagu in Western Cape in 2017. I draw on insights from each of these settings to suggest how knowledge transfer happens in various plant practices. And I really enjoy the diversity of these experiences because I think that that's some of the stuff that we are only starting to see. If you remember when we started all of our plant consciousness commentary, which you can find in the Naturally Conscious community, because all of the old episodes, I'm slowly bringing them out into, I'm slowly copying them over and into YouTube and into other, into my blog, but I'm slow going. So my team is kind of bogged down with a bunch of different things. But the Naturally Conscious community is the place where all of these papers, all of the commentary that we've done, including from the beginning, is there. So please feel free to go there. And that's also the place for us to have these human-plant relationship conversations, right? This is the place where we can feel safe to experiment, to talk about what it means to co-evolve with plants, to share what are the experiences that we're having and get feedback from others. That is the place. And that's the reason why they're all there. But if you remember when we first started and we started with all of these papers, they were kind of dry because it was mainly the, plant physiologists and all of the different botanists that were arguing one with another. And they were trying to be even the philosophers at the time were trying to be really rigid in their conversations in order to prove their scientific argument. As we've moved forward in time, remember we started in about 2006 from the perspective of the papers were from 2006. As we've moved forward in time, especially now that this is 2008, I believe, we are moving into times that allows for a lot more fluidity and of understanding of the fact that papers will take on many different types of dimensions and that they need to incorporate many different aspects of humanity in order for us to really move into a deeper understanding of this connection with plants. So I'm really excited about this. This investigation is not a simple matter of epistemology, even though it might look like one at first glance. In fact, there is a hidden ontological, there's the ontological, and we knew it had to come up, element in all this talk about knowledge. While an ontological aspect is often accepted a priori in studies of other cultures, it would be a mistake to assume that cultivated ontological states are absent from the Western scientific tradition. Assessing how plant knowledge is transferred and produced can give insight into plants as beings and the type of beings we assume that they are. Ethnographic evidence indicates that the production of plant knowledge is not just a matter of cataloging, documenting, and collecting oddments of knowledge. What a great word, oddments. Plant practitioners like Rastafarians and traditional healers argue that it is not just about wanting to know and then committing to the task. Rather, they argue that authentic and true knowledge of plants and their powers requires cultivation of physical, mental, and spiritual, and even altered psychic states that enable knowledge transfers and open the plant practitioner to knowledge acquisition and production. And this piece of it that they're talking about here, that he's talking about here, is one of the reasons why this conversation is so hard to have in academic circles. Because when you are discussing what a plant has told you in one of these states, or what you have understood to be true based on the relationship that you have created with plants, the scientific folks will tell you, will prove it. The only way we found to prove it, and this is one of the things that I feel like is really beneficial, like I feel very grateful that I live at Domenher, is the fact that since I guide people into the woods here and I take people on to different experiences with the plant world, I am able to create experiences that, without driving people to any answer, allows them to have a similar shared experience. And from collecting that data, I can see what are the similarities that approach. But even that is not done in a super scientific way. And so therefore, it's not always accepted by everybody. That's just the way that it is. Okay. Where am I? The cultivation of psychic and body states is consistent with plant practitioners elsewhere. As for instance, among Sangomas, who ritually avoid sex and certain types of food in order to work with healing plants. Critically, these practitioners consider that it is the plants themselves that demand the rituals, actions, observances, and avoidances that produce the states in which the acquisition of plant knowledge is possible. Yes. Plants do not work for those that do not approach them correctly or interact with them in particular ways. That I can confirm across so many different stories. I could tell you so many amazing, fun stories of times when people have approached plants in a way that the plant was like, nope, nope, I am not talking to you. Nope, 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 not there. Which is so, I'm sure that all of you have them too. I'd love to hear some of these stories because I'm sure that you have plenty of them as well. These practitioners thus conceive plants as withholding their healing powers from both healers and patients when they have not been harvested properly or prepared and harvested by someone who is not in a correct state. Furthermore, it is these connections between plants and plant practitioners that make it an ontological question as well as an epistemological one. These practitioners, the practitioner has to produce a particular state of being that is at least somewhat attuned to the plant and vegetal being. A number of plant practitioners speak about plants as if the vegetal being possesses a consciousness of the ethical, moral, political, religious, physical, and psychic state of the person about to interact with them. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you have your stories of that too, right? Your stories of, or your understandings or your experiences with a plant that you have was very clear that that plant understood things about you that you yourself didn't even have clarity on. And the longer you spent time with that plant, the more that that plant was able to share with you information about you that helped you in your own growth. And this is really what it is, right? The whole kind of one of the major benefits of this plant-human relationship that we're developing right now, one of the massive benefits to humanity of this relationship is the fact that these vegetal beings have a historical record, an understanding of time and space and of knowledge that has been acquired throughout all of this existence on this planet, and therefore has a very different way of approaching humanity, right? Our interactions are different and their understandings, right? Kin can see us humans in a different way and therefore provide insight into aspects of ourselves that we don't have clarity on. And so that way, reawakening our own plantness helps us see ourselves with more clarity, but also makes that connection and that channel with these beings that are ever present and always aware of what's happening. It makes it easier for that transfer to happen. And I love that. I think it's super important for us to call that out and recognize that it's what's happening. For instance, different types of healers in the Northern Cape, ranging from Rastafarians to Bungama healers to Bossi doctors, Oh, bush doctors, bossy doctors. That makes sense now when I read bush doctors. Suggest that if you harvest plants in particular ways, the plant will refuse to work with you. Mhm. Think about that in the context of your food. Just think about how much less connective is your food because most of the ways that they're being harvested in commercial operations are not in harmony with the plant. Just think about that for a second. Think. Rastafarians consider plants to recognize greed and to act accordingly, explains Naftali, a Rastafari herbalist I worked with in the late 1990s, when he taught me that I should never take a whole root or too many bulbs from the same area. In his view, he was not simply being conservative minded, but rather suggested that this action would demonstrate greed to the plants and that they would adjust their effects accordingly, which is very similar to what Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in braiding sweetgrass, for example, right? In the fact that the harvest and harvesting and how much of that harvest, right, of in this case, the sweetgrass, as she was talking about, really influences the growth and the effectiveness of the sweetgrass to be able to work with you in that harvest. If a person harvests plants solely for gain, the plant may choose to activate only its negative or harmful effects. Again, think about your food. Think about your food. Thus, plants do not cooperate, interact, or work with and for humans if these have not cultivated certain states. More on this later. The broader question that informs the inquiry in this paper are diverse and somewhat chaotic because of the relative newness of the field of human-plant interfaces. The questions I ask include, how do we get to know plants? Where do we gather the knowledge of various trees, grasses, herbs, plant medicines, edible and toxic plants? Who teaches it to us? What are the mechanisms of a transfer of knowledge? What are the criteria and factors used by humans to determine the values of plants? How do we as humans relate to plants, and what roles do these relations play in the transfer of plant knowledge? More specifically, I explore how this knowledge is transferred from generation to generation, from place to place, and even between species. In this exploratory essay, I want to suggest a few inroads into the world of plant knowledge. I begin by looking at plant knowledge in ethnobotanical studies, specifically at the limits of plant studies. This section draws on Thacker, who argues that the world has become increasingly unthinkable. From a Damanhurian perspective, we would say it's become increasingly non-thinking, because we as human beings have almost lost our ability to create true thought. We've lost our ability to gather and create original thought processes. Almost everything we do is recycled, and oftentimes passing through our conditioning means that not only is it recycled, but it probably even doesn't even represent your true nature, your authentic self, even as much as you want it to, but the conditioning holds us back from being able to do that. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Like, do you think we as human beings are capable of original thought? And if so, is it something that's easy for people, or is it something that instead requires something of us? I'm really curious as to how you interpret this line of unthinkable, increasingly unthinkable, and difficult to comprehend, forcing us to think at the limits of philosophy. It is at these limits that I encounter plants. It is here that new ways of reading and understanding plants and of thinking the conditions of their being lie. Thereafter, I examine and challenge the assumptions about knowledge transmission, transfer, and production in ethnobotanical studies generally. The paper closes with a twist in the tale of plant knowledge and practice by focusing on the cultivation of states that enable knowledge production. Interesting. Thinking at the limits of plant study. In orthodox ethnobotany, some data, specifically with which is ethnographic in nature, is discarded or sanitized. Sanitized, I like that. This data includes information about beliefs about the perception of plants, misreading and varied data about exotic species and other marginalia. With an increased interest in efficacy and scientific validity, ethnobotany has also foregrounded a concern regarding reference collections and chemical composition. In this context, what would it mean to push the boundaries of plant studies within anthropology? And could the marginal data that ethnobotany classically ignores be put to use in theorizing plants? Consideration of this question would allow notions about the social perception of plant mechanisms and ideas about the workings of plants held by our research participants to emerge. I began by thinking at the limits of plant studies, which led me on a journey of reading plants that ranged from the post-humanist tradition and multi-species ethnographies. Where the heck is the accent there? Ethnography. Anyways, I'm just going to keep going. To philosophical and theoretical concerns about plant ontologies. I discovered theorists with very different interests. The engagements with post-humanist theory brought into focus the work of Donna Haraway, which we've talked about multiple times, and those interested in decentering the human. That would be me. I even want to decenter the human seriously in my own life. Like I don't need to be the center. I don't. Not only do they argue that we should treat other life forms or beings equally, but they also point to the critical fact that we as humans are increasingly acting in a planetary context. This approach seems more insightful than the argument in the Anthropocene literature that humans have reached the level of a geological force. Hold on, I want to go back to that. But they also point to the critical fact that we as humans are increasingly acting in a planetary context. This approach seems more insightful than the argument in the Anthropocene literature that humans have reached the level of a geological force. Hence why the term Anthropocene. So this person, Ellis, wouldn't think that Anthropocene as a term doesn't really work because we shouldn't be considering ourselves a geological force, but more of, okay, wait, I want to keep reading this because this is interesting. As a critical trope, the idea of humans as a geological force is open to misreading. Could be viewed, hold on. Could be viewed as arrogance, humans as some pinnacle, a force akin to the wind, the oceans, and so on. In the negative philosophy of Thacker, the concept of the planetary is read as an attempt to displace the human in ways that remind it of its existence as just another thing on the planet, as fleeting and passing as the dinosaurs and fairly insignificant in the long run. This is really interesting, especially because we are a super young race. We are not allowing ourselves to evolve into what other species, where at this point there would be a diversity in any other kind of species. Well, not every other, but most. There would be a diversity of different species within, the same genus. And we as humans, we're just not very good at that. We want to believe that Homo sapiens is everything and not other hominoids, which why we don't have any other hominoids right now, or at least we don't think we have other hominoids right now. This would be really interesting because this is saying, let's stop giving so much power to the human being and putting us as at the same level of like the wind or the oceans, which have continued to be throughout time. But instead, let's think of ourselves as human beings as another existence that does act on a planetary scale, but that can also be fleeting and passing. I like the connection to the dinosaurs, that even though the dinosaurs had a huge impact on the planet, at the same time, they weren't central to the planet and therefore moved on. Interesting. In this line of thinking, the plant cannot be swayed by our politics or appeals to pity. The planet does not care. The Anthropocene as framework says to us that we must collaborate or become extinct. It is this radical interconnectedness hinted at the work of Benet that demands a reorientation in the study of anthropology. We can no longer study humans outside of the planetary. All anthropology now falls within the purview of the planetary, suggesting new methodologies such as multi-species and other than human ethnography. I like this. This is really interesting. Within the field of multi-species ethnography, the work done by Kirksey and Helmreich began to highlight the inter alia, the sociability, sentience, and ontological status of plants. Sociability, sentience, and ontological status. It also allowed me to question some of the fundamental concepts of our own sociality and science, such as time. Time, interesting. Multi-species ethnographies suggest that there might be more to ethnography than revelations about culture, human nature, or the variation of our sociability through both time and space. We can thus do ethnographies of plants, things, paintings, laboratories, and non-traditional forces and subjects. I like that things is not the same as plants. That makes me happy. Binet gave us impetus to the mingle and coexistences that are their ecologies and life itself, and more broadly, the agentivity of things, including the reading on food, plants, and chemicals. In fact, she and others, such as Cohn, discuss the Battisonian model of ecology. I adopt this model not only to seek ecological effects in individual organisms and their connections to other organisms, but rather to see ecological effects as the outcomes of interactions. These thinkers all suggest a radical interconnectedness between humans and plants that makes the study of the human world as its own separate reality an impossible task. I love this line. The radical interconnectedness between humans and plants that makes the study of the human world as its own separate reality an impossible task. That's a quote right there. That's a beautiful quote right there. Ethnographies of the other than human are still new, but several moves have already been made in this direction. For instance, by Moll and Cohn. Overall, the authors cited above would have us examine what Malinowski calls the imponderabilia of actual life. It is these imponderabilia that I am pursuing in a broader study of plant life. The aim is not simply to replay the connections of the world in a human frame, but rather to reclaim the radical interconnectedness that is ignored in everyday practice of botany, ethnobotany, and other sciences, which is something that Natasha Myers also writes about. The fact that even in the plant sciences, there's like this, we don't give ourselves permission, or ourselves. In the plant sciences, many of those sciences do not, especially younger ones, do not give themselves permissions to really recognize the interconnectedness and how that interconnectedness affects your work and your ability and what you receive directly from the plant. The suggestion here is in the everyday practice of botany, ethnobotany, and other sciences. The suggestion here is for an interconnectedness that makes it a certainty that we, plants, water, animals, things, are talking to each other, even if, for the most part, this form is inaudible or outside of our cognition. Martyr suggests as the definition of plant life that it is a certain manner and rhythm of movement we customarily disregard, since it is too subtle to be registered by an everyday setting by our cognitive and perceptual apparatus. I don't think that it's too subtle, to be honest. I think we've just bred out of us. Many of us, we're conditioned to not believe it exists at all. I mean, how can you recognize it if you have been told your entire life that it does not exist? It just seems so incredibly difficult. So incredibly difficult. So this is close to what Malinowski said about his imponderabilia. These observed subtleties of manner that not only the most seasoned observers can recognize and record. Seeing and recording these imponderabilia in people and their engagement with plants is thus the goal of research into the human-plant interface, and one that, again, as Malinowski suggested about human beings, the ethnographer is ideally placed to investigate. This is really interesting. I like it. I like this at all. Knowledge transfers. So, knowledge transfers. I first take a quick historical detour to discuss two aspects of the beginning of ethnobotany. The first focuses on the discipline's promise of discovery and the characters that stood at the center of its origins. The second features its angst, one that is really very modern and not just part of the psychology of particular disciplines, about loss, urgency, and salvage. I heard a really interesting thing today about grief that I'm going to expand on in a podcast episode because it was just so interesting. But I do think that loss, urgency, salvage, and um, yeah, grief. I think we underestimate the need and the importance of recognizing and going through grief. It is my position that these two features of ethnobotanical research drive its practice in the present and at the same time shape the way in which I conducted my inquiry and prefigure some of the conclusions I draw. From its inception, ethnobotany has been driven by the promise of discovery. Two of its earliest and most celebrated students were credited with great discoveries. Albert Hoffman with that of LSD and Richard Schultz with magic mushrooms. Psilocybin, but yeah. Another, Wade Davis, uncovered the formula for the deadly torpor-producing zombie poison as well as its antidote. Other ethnobotanists followed suit, and the idea of discoveries arguably became one of the fundamental principles of ethnobotany. This soon shifted to a discourse about salvage. Students of anthropology and of indigenous knowledge quickly moved from simple attempts to discover to a practice that aims to save and document a disappearing knowledge. Ethnobotany implicitly assumes an urgency in its business, conceiving and hence, see, this is the reason why I was talking about the grief. It's also grief. Conceiving its practice to be located in a context of vanishing cultures and ways of life, language loss, and species loss. This anxiety possibly came from a very real situation of loss globally and the apparent homogenizing effect of the advancing tide of Western capital that threatened to replace all other forms of being. One of the assumptions at the center of much ethnobotanical research since then has been the perceived necessity of salvaging knowledge that was being lost or whose continued existence into the next generation might be under threat. Much ethnobotanical research reflects the urgency of knowledge transfer, not only in its findings, but often also in proposals and funding applications. What could be more valuable to a science than the idea that knowledge is about to go missing forever? And that is the task of that very field of practice, to gather the remaining vestiges into a great ethnographic archive. This great archive has been termed the ethnosphere, the cultural equivalent of the biosphere. The urgency to rescue cultural forms that are under threat of disappearing has been around for as long as colonialism. The lament about the dying and disappearing primitive is similar to that heard now in reference to indigenous knowledge. I don't know. I always take a minute to read certain sentences because I want them to really sit in me as to how I feel about them. I do not mean to deny here that there is some kind of loss. That is clearly the case. My point is, rather than the focus on the urgency of the loss, rather that the focus on the urgency of this loss makes us overlook less apparent and less ethnically glamorous processes. This is definitely true, and this is the case for a lot of plant practices. And if you study or if you listen to many of the plant researchers, that's the word I'm looking for, one of the struggles that they have is that obviously funding tends to go towards the glamorous. And so therefore, in our desire to search for glamorous beings, we are missing out on a wealth of knowledge and information around the plant kinhome, because that world is mundane. And that's the beauty of it. The beauty and the importance of it is the fact that it is mundane. It is the fact that it is the glue that holds us all together, that holds multiple species together. And so that glue is so average. It is so a part of the knowledge. It's so it's so done by common species sometimes that we don't recognize the importance of it or the glamour of it. It's like, who wants to really study grasses when grass is everywhere, and that kind of perspective. So I get what he's saying here is that there is clearly a case of a loss, but that urgency of just looking for the loss is means that we sometimes may be missing the forest for the trees. We may not be seeing the kind of mundane and everyday things that are disappearing, but that have been holding us together in multiple different ways, both culturally as well as physiologically and into environmentally. My argument is that the work in salvage anthropology, sometimes also known urgent anthropology, offers a self-reinforcing impetus for research as the world is constantly changing. However, if, as I suggest, the narrative of loss and thus urgency is removed, what motivations are there to continue research in ethnobotany? This paper is about knowledge retention and its continued transmission in communities and through generation. This is set against the common assertion in the frame of salvage ethnobotany that younger generations are not interested in learning about plants and their uses, thus that this knowledge is being lost. I want to challenge this assertion about the apparent loss of knowledge from several quarters. First, I investigate work already done in the field to examine whether the claim about loss is an accurate description of those situations and how this would be proven. Second, I examine the mechanics of knowledge transmission in a number of cases. Ethnographic data suggests that our understanding of knowledge transfers and production, as well as reduction to intergenerational transmissions from old to young, is problematic. Here, I scrutinize the assertion that the actual mechanics of these knowledge transfers are poorly understood, researched, and basically under-theorized. This is going to be interesting. I'm really curious about this because this is a big piece. We've talked about this multiple times inside of the naturally conscious community from, generational transfer and how is it that the knowledge about and connection with plants is transmitted from generation to generation. I do see, this is totally before we've gotten into it, I do see that there are some aspects that get passed on through just behavior and storytelling and recognition of what generations have done. I also see that there are many things that are being lost, and I'm curious as to how he's going to bridge this gap. 3 ethnographic contexts show that the general pattern often encountered, and the one that indeed seems logical, is not the only process of knowledge transfer. The first is a series of encounters with elderly people, identified as research partners on the basis of the assumption that they know more about plants than younger demographic groups. Yet, amongst these elderly people that I spoke to, I was surprised to find that they would often check with each other to determine the exact use of a plant that I had asked them about. It showed how, in the various senior citizen groups and towns in the Matsikama municipality, the elderly learn from each other. And I do see this. This is an interesting thing and I do hope that our generations, as we get older, kind of reinforce this again. I hope that it's something that comes easier with age, because this I do see, especially with the advent of the internet, right? It's easier for us to go and check online, which has its benefits, right? There's lots for us to see, but that's not to take away from how much we learn from our own experiences, and therefore checking in with people in your own demographic who have had direct impact or have used, especially in your local area, right? Place specific feedback is so incredibly important and useful. And so therefore, I hope that we don't lose that. And I hope that even our generation that grew up, searching for things on the internet still checks in with others, and doesn't rely only on what we find online, but that we really do create those bonds and those connections that are place specific and that help me better understand the location in which I'm living in by your experiences and the experiences of others. There thus does not seem to be a simple and direct line of transmission from, say, older to younger people. The lines of transmission rather seem to be both horizontal between peoples of similar age sets and vertical down generational lines. Or there are, as others have termed them, diachronic and synchronic forms of transmission. Exchanges between the elderly and younger generations are not the only sorts of plant knowledge. A photo voice project I conducted with high school learners in Kisi Valley revealed some interesting mechanics of knowledge transfer and some remarkable plant practices. The exercise revealed a number of sources of knowledge about plants, play, gardening. I'm glad that he included play. I'm glad that he included play. Play, gardening, parents and grandparents, and work. I mention high school learners because one of the key assumptions of ethnobotany is that the younger generations are not learning, and indeed are not interested in learning about plants. In the Photo Voice project, learners were divided into 5 groups of 6 or 7 learners and tasked with exploring their environment and documenting through photographs and narratives 5 different plants that they thought were important to them. These young people recorded medicinal, culinary, animal feeding, and aesthetic uses related to play. The use of plants as toys or as part of or central to games they played alerted me to the potential avenues of knowledge production and transfer. It would seem that young people actively and directly engaged with plants over time build up their own personal archive of plants that they know. Among other things, the learners mentioned various grass species as places where they played and others that they integrated into their games because grass is awesome. I love grass. I love grass. They recorded how they would break or slice open the fleshy parts of the butterbus, and use the pieces as skis or like roller skates. The fleshy interior is slippery and allows them to slide on certain certain surfaces. I don't know if I love that they're killing the plants, but one step at a time. The learners are often mentioned medicinal uses. When asked for the origin of their medical knowledge, the learners often cited watching as well as being instructed by their parents and grandparents. Other ways of learning, such as play, observation, and labor, were also given as sources of knowledge. Learning to play and experimentation is an important indicator here, a form of learning recognized in other areas of knowledge acquisition, but not previously regarding plant knowledge. It further shows that plant knowledge may even be imparted much earlier than orthodox ethnobotanical studies would suggest. Interesting. Okay, hold on, I'm writing down the time. Knowledge shaping. Knowledge shaping. Studies reviewing plant knowledge, especially in so-called traditional settings, should not overlook or dismiss the innovative and syncretic practices of some plant uses and practitioners. Of all the plant practitioners I have encountered, Rastafarians have showed the greatest capacity for innovative and syncretic uses of plant species. I am so excited to be reading a paper that talks about Rastafarians in a positive light. Their plant practices are ready to absorb. Hold on, plant should be Rastav. Are ready to absorb and assimilate a range of different cultural, regional specific, ecological, and alternative plant knowledges or practices. The suggestion here is that the Rastafari system is open to all plant practices, no matter their origin, as long as they do not contradict their beliefs. I have encountered experimentation among other plant practitioners, but few have demonstrated such an openness and willingness to integrate new plant knowledge as the Rastafarian practitioners. My own ethnographic encounters indicate the various traditional herbalists and Krui doctors in Southern Africa trying new things that they are open to experimentation, but that their new medications can also contain some quite dubious substances. Thus, Sangomas have told me that they use brake fluid in their medicines because it literally stops witchcraft in its tracks. I hope that you're using that topically and not, or maybe around the person and not ingesting it or taking it in. One of the Krui doctors I spoke to in the Matsikama research claimed to massage transmission fluid into the legs of bewitched individuals to draw out the poison. Is that safe? I don't know what's in brake fluid. Mm. Rastafarians, in contrast, would consider these substances as polluting and would never include them in their practice. They rather limit their experimentation to plant-based materials and substances. In fact, their inclusion of plant materials is so far-ranging that I have even encountered frankincense imported from Ethiopia in some Rastafarian plant practices. There are also reports of local Rastafarian experimentation with the ginseng root obtained from unknown sources. It's because it's really hard to find, to be honest. We're sort of depleting it with all of our Chinese medicine beliefs, which is a shame. Though others have frowned on its use for the erratic behavior it seems to trigger in some patients. The suggestion is that although plants are generally considered safe, they should be used with caution. Yeah, Rastafarians consider it generally acceptable to work with natural products. They nevertheless observe these with great care to ensure that they use them appropriately and safely. Before I provide more ethnographic examples, let me first elaborate on a broader issue revealed by this syncretic plant use, namely the question of indigenous, biomesque, regional, or culture specific plant uses. I'm curious as to where he's going to go with this because I am quite surprised that the Rastafarians would introduce plants that are not part of their local landscapes. That just seems kind of bizarre. The idea here is that a culture or other social grouping is responsible for the preservation and transmission of certain form of knowledge. Evidence suggests that knowledge holders tend to be individuals, not groups. The idea that there is a set of herbal knowledge, a materia medica, that is closed off and may be the sole intellectual property of a single cultural, ethnic, or historically constituted group is erroneous. Yeah. Very often, individuals have learned their plant practices from a variety of sources, and these vary in terms of ecology, region, culture, and national origin. The Rastafari case already showed that a single origin model of plant practice is faulty. The case of Gogo Mokete, with whom I worked in Cape Town, reiterates this point. Gogo was born in the vicinity of Butterworth in Eastern Cape. As an adult, he hitchhiked to Switzerland to train. How do you hitchhike from there to Switzerland? Amazing. To train with a trainer and mentor. After traveling for several weeks, he arrived at his destination only to be chastised by the diviner for being late. She claimed, been waiting months for him. Gogo, a Xhosa man, thus became apprenticed to a Swazi diviner who taught him about the plants of the entire southern Africa and not only Switzerland. Oh no, Swaziland. My goodness, that's why I'm reading this all wrong. Okay, I apologize sincerely to everybody for me reading that wrong. This tells you my European bias. I apologize profusely for what I just said. Let me go back. He hitchhiked to Swaziland. Oh my God, Swaziland with a trainer and mentor. So we have a Xhosa man thus became apprenticed to a Swazi diviner who taught him about the plants of the entire southern Africa and not only Swaziland, the Eastern Cape, or any other piece of it. This circulation across large spaces is confirmed by Kep, who tracked the movements of plants from the Eastern Cape to the larger traditional medicine markets in Durban and Johannesburg, confirming that not only plants but also practices around them traverse cultural, spatial, religious, and ecological barriers. Especially when I don't lose my page. Oh, so annoying. Where am I? Okay, yeah. Or was he especially? Especially those that are imposed by Western scientific practice. For this reason, practices around plants cannot be studied in a manner that limits them to regions, ethnic groups, or ecological zones. How does this, though, apply to place-based I'm so curious as to whether or not he addresses this. If not, we'll stop for a second and we'll think about it. As a student of plant practices, it is vital to follow the plants, not the paradigm. Okay, this makes more sense. Follow the plants, not the paradigm. In the final analysis, it would seem that much of the understanding that we have of the range of plant practices is confirmed by a very limited cultural and biomic, biomestic, biomesticity model. This paper, with its wide-ranging ethnographic examples, an attempt to push us away from this form of plant epistemology. As the final sections of this paper make clear, some of our ethnographic participants blended epistemology and ontology and suggested a novel method to the investigation of plants. Their methodological point is that knowledge can only be acquired if accompanied by the correct ontological states, to be explored in detail in the last section of this paper. For now, I briefly want to return to the use of the senses in the production of knowledge about and as a form of engagement with plants. Many of the plant practitioners I worked with suggest that they can only know plants if they have some form of contact with them. In my search for herbalists in the Matsikama region, the Rastafarians in Klawar all referred me to one particular old man, Abraham Bowie. A number of Rastafarians claimed that they had learned about plants through him, that he had been a herbalist and tour doctor, a witch doctor, all his life, and that he knew the plants of the region best. When I finally arrived at his home, very excited about the possibility of learning from and working with such a respected specialist, I met with some disappointment. Abraham had become infirm and could not walk well anymore, and he was not very talkative, claiming that he no longer remembered many of the plants. If he could but get to the veld to walk among, see, touch, and taste the plants, then he might possibly remember. The critical point in his claim was that his knowledge was bound up to the actual sensorial engagement with plants. Because of a protracted lack of contact due to his illness, his knowledge had thus become a little rusty. I actually find this really interesting because, so I was thinking about this in terms of like COVID. So for most people, COVID was a lack of contact. And I'm very curious if there are any research studies or if this could trigger any kind of research studies connected to when, post-COVID loss of connection for some people. On the other hand, for others who live near woods, it reinforced their connection because not being able to go out and participate in society, what did they do? They spent a lot of time in the woods. And I'm curious as to if these people, like I can speak about myself, I know that my connection to and knowledge with certain kinds of plants has definitely diminished because once COVID was over and I kind of retook my place working mainly with houseplants and then a select number of wild plants, I have increased tenfold my relationship and my knowledge and my understanding and my work with all of these types of plants, to the detriment, of course, to other plants that I was working very closely with and had a close relationship with, but I no longer feel as comfortable stating or speaking about those plants because I don't have that strong of a connection. As a matter of fact, in next week's podcast, I talk about chickweed, and chickweed was definitely a plant that I worked with very, very, very closely during COVID time. And now that chickweed has come back into my space, it took me a minute to reconnect back into chickweed and to get a better understanding of what it is or to understand more clearly what it is that chickweed wanted to share with me and with humanity in general, because I have not been spending as much time with chickweed. Chickweed doesn't necessarily grow in the areas in which I am right now so easily, as opposed to other wild plants like purslane that has continued to be, or cattail, because I continue to experience cattail in the places that I have always experienced cattail, or dandelion, or sorrel, or clover, or all of these other types of plants that I am working actually much more closely with now. So this makes perfect sense to me, the idea that you would lose that. It's almost like, how is it? Several other elderly research participants made a claim about the direct engagement with plants, and that walking in the veld was a stimulus for remembering knowledge, because that's the whispering you get when you do this. When you walk in those areas, you get that direct whispering from the plants. And I think that that's what reinforces the knowledge. It's not, yes, I'm sure you have book knowledge, but that's not what it is working with plants. And plants themselves evolve. I bet you anything that this is me guessing, okay? Or me, a supposition, or, my thoughts. But I bet you that even if you take a healer over time, I wonder if over the time of over a lifetime, how they describe the plants also change over time, because over time, the plants themselves can come in to our sphere and our needs differently. And I would bet that there's some relationship here that I just bet that there's a difference. I'm so curious to see it. I read this as a significant claim, namely that knowledge is intricately linked to the material engagement with and experience of the being known. I guess he probably didn't want to write being known, right? But the being known to memories precipitating from contact with the senses. It is important to note that the question here is not just one of method of knowledge production. It is also critically one of access to the physical areas where plants grow. Throughout my research, participants seemed to propose that a lack of access to the veld severely limited their recall of and ability to learn about plants and their knowledge of plants more generally, which makes sense, right? How many people who do not regularly, even if you do get training and then you go and you live in an area where you don't have access to the plants that you were working with, it almost seems to evaporate, because I'm still convinced the connection is not like rote memory. It's not that. It's a visceral connection. It's a connection that is alive and that is based on relationship in order for me to promote and speak about these plants. Land tenure and poor access to nature featured strongly as a barrier to direct experience of plants, and thus familiarity with plants or with plants, particular species. I want to return to the sensorial innovation and plant knowledge. In studies of a Rastafari herbalist, Philander documents a significant number of innovative or new uses of particular plants or knowledge about a new species not previously captured by plant compendiums. In my fieldwork, I have also seen innovation in Rastafarian plant practices. This method has at least two components. First, a sensorial aspect, and second, the encounter with other plant practitioners and knowledge holders. The Rastafari engagement with plants is always open, and Rastafari specialists collect plant knowledge everywhere they encounter it. There are limits to the inclusion of certain uses and specific species. However, for some Rastafarians, the use of plants associated with witchcraft is not allowed. But it would seem that the line between medicinal and anti-personal use is not always clear. The references I've heard in that plants' use have to be confined to what some Rastafarians term the healing of the nation. This term is derived from biblical references in reggae songs. I like that. Biblical references in reggae songs. The idea is that Yah has provided the herbs as a healing to the nations, and that a responsible bush doctor must apply it only for the purpose of healing. While healing can take the form of purging evil spirits and counteracting wickedness, this is the extent to which Rastafari herbal practices deals with negative magic and witchcraft. This allows me to return to the question of methods in producing knowledge. On one of the transect walks I did with a number of Rastafarians in the Matsikami region, I asked Levi about kakibos, Tagetes minuta. I don't know exactly which plant, but kakibos. Kakibos. I've heard that term before. I've heard that plant. An aromatic plant that smells like a mild camphor or mentholated ointment. I showed him a specimen that he had walked past several times. He first claimed that he did not know the plant. But as soon as he smelled it, he immediately assigned it a use, a method of extraction and application. He stated that the plant could be used for rubbing on tired legs and for treating arthritis, and that he would extract the active ingredient by frying the leaves in oil at a low temperature. I also witnessed how a Rastafari herbalist used the sensorial method to develop a new medicine. This experience made me realize that the practice of academic research actually contributes to the production of plant knowledge in those participating in research. The practice of academic research contributes to the production of plant knowledge in those participating in research. Because he asked about the plants, because he was conducting research, and then in asking about the plants, the use became visible to them. That makes sense. Research is often thought of a one-sided and neutral extractive engagement for the benefit of Western university-trained academic audience. My interacting with the Rastafarian suggested that my research could and did represent a two-way street. I realized, for example, that Levi, I'm going to go with Levi, had gleaned some of his knowledge about plants and their uses from a booklet about plants in the region that had been compiled by a precursor project to the current investigation. Similarly, Rastafarian, I don't know. I mean, yes, possible, but I still think that also in part, you pass a plant you don't necessarily recognize, you don't have a relationship with that plant, then all of a sudden that plant becomes visible to you from the research itself. I'm not sure if this is what he meant, but this is how I would interpret that. And it becomes visible, that plant becomes visible to you based on the research being done. Sorry, my plant paper's all over the place. The research being done. And then from there, you recognize the plant more. I'm going to go with that because that feels good too. I see the booklet part, but I feel like this is good. Similarly, Rastafari herb sellers in some towns of the Matsikama region use the same booklet to point out the uses of plants in their pharmacopoeia. Rastafari plant practices can thus be characterized as open and syncretic. This syncretism means that information is gathered from multiple sources, people, books, researchers, through method and sensorium, so much so that it seems that the mainstay of the Rastafari plant system is almost exclusively about the innovative encounter with plants. I call these instances where knowledge is shared or where the selective transmission of specialized knowledge is affected by the academic research encounter, knowledge shaping. The research encounter is as much a moment of knowledge production for our participants as it is for us. In fact, the mere fact that our research is about plants shapes the way in which knowledge is produced in a particular meeting. In my research, I asked my interlocutors, God, I can't speak, and participants to recall plants. This called on the research participants to recall their knowledge and to critically engage with and reflect on what they knew about plants and the like. An ethnographic example on the use of the garden methodology in Matsikama illustrates the large number of types of data produced in this matter. A garden methodology is simply using the gardens of our participants to elicit data about plants and knowledge of plants and plant practices. I began the research encounter by asking each participant for his or her 3 favorite plants. The conversation often moved from there to a range of plant-related topics, ranging from medicinal plants to beliefs, from food and culinary plants to plant habits, wants and origins, and so on. What amazed me is that people who would not usually be considered plant experts related stories and uses of large number of garden and other species. The physical presence of the garden caused reflective moments in which the owner was suddenly flooded with recall about plants. Garden encounters thus forced recall through the direct physical co-presence of and interaction with plants. And I think that this line right here is one of the most important aspects that he is coming to terms with. garden encounters, which in general, it goes back to what I was talking about earlier with the medicinal, with the bush doctor who, through the encounter with a plant, is able to express more about this particular plant. Yes, it's easy for us to think that what's happening is the fact that it's, the person read some knowledge about this plant. And maybe that is true, but still, even when you read, I have plenty of people who ask me all the time about, remedies or what plant is good or what really, if I have not had a personal relationship with the plant, as much as I may read that such and such a plant is good for such and such a thing, forget it. I am not going to say it. And not because I censor myself, it just doesn't come out in the time. I has to be very specific to an encounter that I have had with that. Let me rephrase this, a prolonged encounter that I have had. It doesn't come from a single one-time encounter, but a prolonged encounter allows me to garner information and knowledge that then I can present to others. So it makes sense that garden encounters force the recall of that interaction with plants. And so therefore, and it's not just that it's not that I have to have prolonged exposure to what I am specifically talking about with the plant, but the prolonged exposure is not the right word, connection with that plant allows me to intuitively feel in to the plant's capabilities and understandings and knowledge, because the plant then is able to shape and share that pieces with me. And I feel like that is really the essence of it more. And this is why when we were talking about, hold on, change this about. Okay, hold on. My little kind of conversation piece right now. This is the reason why nature in the city is so important. Nature in the city, yes, there is all the aspects of biophilia and the fact that awe and wonder and our health and all these aspects. That is one part of it that is amazingly important and super enriching for us as human beings. Also, but there is the other side of it, that is that exposure in parks, in local areas, in my rooftop gardens, in just even beautiful, co-created with plants landscaping provides me access to and relationships that I might not be able to encounter on my own. And these relationships, by passing by a plant every single day on my way to work, or as I'm taking, the dog for a walk, or whatever it might be doing when I'm going to go to get my morning coffee or tea, that exposure I have found in my own work changes the way that I relate to the plants. And therefore I am able to learn more through osmosis. Even if I never look up that plant, I know that there have been several plants that I walk past on a regular basis. And over time, I find myself staring at that plant and sometimes stopping and spending a minute with that plant. I have no idea why. It's not like I even know what species the plant is, but there's something brewing. And over time, that relationship becomes more clear. And therefore, I can, reawaken aspects of myself, but also open myself to a deeper connection with that plant, regardless of whether or not, from a book perspective, I know what species and what are the capabilities and whether or not that plant is invasive or not. That's not the point. The point is that those relationships. So it makes sense that we need that contact. We need that access in order for us to really enrich our lives with these relationships and to reawaken parts of ourselves that are dormant and that we don't have ability to access on its own. Okay. By placing the research encounter into that space, a moment of knowledge shaping was created, and everyday gardeners were transformed into plant practitioners with specialist expertise. Exactly. Plant blindness. Okay, hold on. Access. I need to figure out how to write things faster. It's like, I don't know. So this is plant blindness, magic, and vegetal agency. Baudelaire's 1981 statement that the finest trick of the devil is to persuade you that he does not exist finds parallels in the plant world. The greatest trick of the plant world is to let us believe plants are not there. Is that really a plant? Is that really a trick that the plants want? As humans, we suffer from what some botanists call plant blindness. This means that we quite literally do not see plants as individuated or specific beings, and that our culturally attuned brains give primacy to other things and beings. Another way to put it is just to say that for some humans and in some societies, plants are background. Sad, but so true. To begin this line of argument, let me refer to the short story entitled The Sagebrush Kid. In the story, we are introduced to a frontier couple that move to a farm in the American Northwest and settles on a plot of land inhabited by a carnivorous sagebush. How do I not know this story? Do you know this story? A carnivorous sagebush. Seeing that they have no children, they adopt the bush and feed it unsuspecting wayfarers. What is this? Like Little Shop of Horrors Part 2? Seeing that they have, the plant outlives them, but continues to feed on passersby. In all this vegetal carnivory, we are never shown or enlightened about the exact mechanism by which the plant consumes its food. The only thing that are alluded to are the after effects, such as tattered clothes, odd clues to this long ago presence of a human or animal victim, and other suggestions of fatal rhizomatic or dendritic embraces. So while we are well aware of the ends, namely predation, the exact details of the carnivorous plant's agency remain obscure, a form of plant blindness. I hadn't thought about that, but it is true. I mean, at least in Little Shop of Horrors, we see how, Aubrey eats. The story reminds me of Martyr's interpretation of Batisonian ecology. To him, Battison saw ecology not in individual parts or pieces of the ecological chain, but rather posited that agency, intentionally and thought, non-conscious thought in the case of plants or ecology. Whoa, back up here. What do you mean non-conscious thought? Are you trying to tell me that after everything you've talked to me about, and in your premise where you talk about the fact that plants, that there is like even psychic states in order for you to be able to receive information from plants, you're trying to tell me plants are non-conscious? Oh, I hope I read that wrong. If you read that differently, like, is he really saying that plants are not conscious? Oh, these are fighting words. I mean, it's just weird given everything that we've just experienced with this paper, that you would think that plants are not conscious. Okay. Can be deduced from looking at the whole process and its parts and seeing its effects. Plant blindness is caught up in recognizing the agency of only the individual parts. It is overcome by seeing agency beyond individuals and parts. I can add a number of other examples of plant blindness just to convince the reader. Oh, no, trust me, we here know about plant blindness. We know plant blindness exists. We have no doubts. I have often been told in my musings and inquiries into plants and their agency that until something or some event alerted a person to plants as individual entities or types, many people just saw green. Literature reflects this plant blindness in a very noticeable manner. On his way to find Kurtz in Conrad's epic Heart of Darkness, Marlowe peers at the forest scenery from his vantage at the helm of the riverboat, but sees nothing but a green wall. As in my ethnographic encounters, this literary figure sees the undifferentiated collection vegetation, but cannot discern species, types, or even specimens. So, as in the quote from Baudelaire's that opens this section, vegetal and plant beings have engaged in the finest of trickery by hiding in plain sight of humans who cannot see the trees for the forest. In this section, it is to this unseenness and trickery by plants I want to turn. The turn to the absence of plants in people's imagination and their everyday lives reveals an interesting perception about how plant knowledge becomes apparent, or how it is or is not revealed to humans. Let me begin with an aside on magic. I wonder what he's going to say about magic. For those that give thought to magic, me, I give thought, lots of thought to magic. It is in a similar obfuscation of the mechanism that magic rests. The magic of plants is thus partly that they are encountered by humans with a blindness for plants. When speaking to plant practitioners over the years, it has become clear to me that many do not feel the need to elaborate on the precise mechanisms internal to plants that give rise to effects such as health in human, attraction of another human in an amorous way, or a range of magical, apotropaic, allopathic, divinatory, and or any sundry effect attributed to plants, trees, vegetables, residues, or derivatives. Explanations lapse into what has been called microdramatics. Stories about obfuscated, unclear, ephemeral gossamer processes are scaled down to be readable. I'm going to keep reading, but it sounds to me like what he's saying is the fact that I don't need to know exactly what pheromone is being, or what chemical hormone or whatever is being, volatile organic chemical is being put out by a plant in order to understand my reaction to plants. It means that I'm suffering from plant blindness. But, I don't know what's happening with humans either. I don't know what kind of, odors and smells are triggering my pheromones that make me feel a certain way about somebody. So am I human blindness? Oh, I hope I am reading this wrong because I hope I'm reading this wrong. Explanations that delve into the microdramatic to explain plant mechanisms and processes are as common in hard sciences as in ethnoscience. One such encounter with chemists, pharmacognostics, and other natural sciences took place at the Inspire 2016 Grain Medicine Symposium, hosted and organized by the Department of Anthropology at the University of Western Cape. In a presentation on the cola nuts as a source of vitamin E, Richholm led the audience into the microdramatic world of molecules who have affinities, seek each other out, and behave in very human ways. The language of chemistry and drug discovery seems to be as much about describing the active life of molecules as that of the social sciences is about describing performances of people. My point is that plant knowledge seems to be couched in a language that is as much metaphor as magic, regardless of whether it's located in the natural sciences or in ethnoscience. Both these terrains deal with plant blindness in a very similar way, with reference to the magical as performative. Are you understanding what he's saying? Yeah, right? How can you ever have thought if you're not conscious? There's some weird stuff going. Okay, hold on. Let's see. Both these terrains deal with plant blindness in very similar ways, with reference to the magical as performative. I wish he would define his terms. How are you defining magical? Many of the Rastafarians I have worked with over the years make reference to a similar process of blindness about plants. They argue that most human beings do not truly see plants. Their definitions of blindness is a wide one, including additional senses to the visual as well as cosmology. Okay, I'm with them on that. What is significant about the Rastafari worldview is that it suggests a way out of plant blindness through cosmological and sensorial engagement. In order to explain this further, we must first note a few aspects of Rastafari philosophy and religion. For Rastafarians, everyone who lives in Babylon, in their worldview, the capitalist systems of cities, is deluded by Christianity, Satanism, and colonialism. Is deluded by Christianity, Satanism, and colonialism, and thus, defiled by pollution and closed off from alternative realities. Well, that's pretty broad speaking. I mean, I'm not necessarily disagreeing that people are deluded, and definitely defiled by pollution. That one I can agree with easily. These realities remain hidden as long as we choose to live in a particular way. Access to these alter worlds is granted mostly through the keeping of avoidances and taboos. For this reason, Rastafarians do not cut their hair, do not eat meat, and prefer the purity of mountains and nature to the pollution of cities. Another I would love to hear if anybody knows, I'd love to hear the philosophy Rastafarians have around not cutting their hair. I'm sure that it's well known. I don't know it. I apologize for my ignorance of that, but I'm just so curious because if I have pollutants in me, don't they come out in my hair? And therefore, it's better to cut it? Another concept that structures their avoidance is that of chemical, a term that denotes a whole range of molecular and modern polluting and or additive substances and effects. Rastafarians do not use cigarettes, although they are made from plant matter, because of the understanding that they contain chemical impurities linked to industrial manufacturing processes and the apparent wicked ways of the Babylonians. Okay, I can agree with that too. That plot and scheme to bring about the destruction of Jah's people. Avoidance of chemicals in cigarettes, meat, and manufactured items, and of dirt and pollution is thought to cultivate a pure physical and ontological state that removes the barriers that limit true sight. I'm not necessarily disagreeing. I just don't think that it's like all meat or all manufactured items. It's about how. And so, but I get it that in a world where you can't figure out the how, let's just avoid it all. But there are lots of other things that are manufactured. I guess manufactured items in general is what they're saying. So any manufactured, ooh, that's so curious. Now I'm so curious. I feel like I want to go off and do research. It is thought to cultivate a pure physical and ontological state that removes the barriers and limits true sights. In the Rastafari worldview, the rest of the world lives and labors under a kind of Babylonian false consciousness that closes off the true nature of the world, according to this Rastafarian Marxism. The world cannot simply be understood. In fact, Rastafarians must cultivate a state in which they're able to overstand, thus to be in a state that is beyond subjugated forms of knowing, basically to liberate yourself from your conditioning. Right? I mean, that sounds like what they're saying. It sounds like exactly what you're saying. Once this state is achieved, Rastafarians argue, individuals can engage with and become aware of plant processes and mechanisms around them. Rastafarians overstand that because of their religious beliefs and practices, they have gained special privileged states that make them less plant blind. The rest of humanity remains tuned out to the messages and activities of plants. Well, like no. Some of us have found ways. Some of us. Some of us. In some sense, the argument is thus that we who remain plant blind suffer not just a visual debility, but also from an anesthesia that closes our broader sensorial world off to the potentiality and possibility or even powers of plants. I can agree with this. This is what I talk about when I talk about, reawakening your plantness, right? That's exactly it. This is exactly the same principle. Is the fact that when your inner plantness, which is this state, probably it sounds like they're saying, has been shut down, then of course you don't have the ability to access these aspects of yourself. Further, Rastafarians suggest that smells, taste, touch, and even supersensory auditory sounds of plants described as a spiritual supernatural rope mean very little in the lives of most Babylonian people. It is only with the Rastafari way of seeing, not only, I mean, seriously, folks, like you've got me on the philosophy perspective. I totally understand that, but please don't tell me that you're the only peoples that can experience that. It is only with the Rastafari way of seeing, with overstanding, that certain vegetal vistas open up. No. When you reconnect to your plantness, folks, when you reconnect to your plantness in whatever ways, and there's lots of different ways, we talk about them all the time in the naturally conscious community, these things open up. I don't believe that that's confined to just one. It's interesting because they absorbed and they take in from other philosophies and other, activities around them. And yet at the same time, they feel like they're the only ones. The anesthesia can persist even in those who have opened themselves to the messages of the plant world, so that plants still need to remind them of their presence and message. Okay, Nathan shows how Rastafari plant collection methods, include those ways in which plants themselves signal to the plant practitioners, with Rastafarians describing how plants communicate with them by pulling them back, tugging at them, brushing against them, catching them with their thorns, barbs, or textures. Oh, we can all agree to this. So far, we're all in agreement. This definitely happens. In closing, as an ontology, the Rastafari worldview demands that knowledge holders and students of plants cosmologically retune themselves to the world of plants in order that they make sense of this world of sensory signs and effects that is the vegetal semiotic system. Again, I am agreeing with this so far. Just don't tell me you're the only ones that can do it, but I am agreeing with the mechanisms that you're talking about. Knowledge is thus not just a scientific method, but an active process of becoming and knowing in the moment. Yes, yes, and yes. Let us return to the magic I promised in the heading of this section. What is this magic of the vegetal world? First, imagine, wait, hold on. This is the conclusion. Sounds like 34, 44. Conclusion. Okay, let us return to the magic I promised in the heading of this section. What is this magic of the vegetal world? First, imagine a person on the street, any street, back turned to a tree planted along the sidewalk. The person is unaware that at any moment the tree could embrace her with its branches, unaware of the monster that looks. Monster? Let's see where he's going with this. This almost horror movie-like moment of tentacular agency has been examined in literary theory discussions of plants in science fiction and horror literature. Locked into this moment in a vast potential power, yet one of which one party is quite unaware. A plant or tree stands there mute, at rest, inactive, without agency. Or at least this is what humans think and are taught to believe. Falsely so. Falsely so, folks. Falsely so. Please take a look at the plant around you. Take a moment to enter into that plant's state, and you will recognize falsely so. The trick is that trees are not mute and not immobile. Exactly. They have potential energy, they have chemical energy, and there is an agency that humans miss in their perceptual system. They are aware. They are aware. They are intelligent. They are thinking. And, I know controversially said, they are conscious. The great trick is that a great power to be medicinal, to fall, to cause violence, to poison, to consume us when we die, and to do so many other things is locked in a field unavailable to humans, so that we can be excused if we thought of it as magic. I get his magic comment now. Basically, because people who are experiencing plant blindness cannot see really who plants are for who they are and for therefore their relationship to humans. It's a field that's unavailable to humans. Therefore, it is considered magic when they do things. Okay, I get it. I'm with you on that. Okay. I think that was pretty interesting. There's lots to think about here. I'm trying to get to the top of it so that I can show you again the name of the paper. Unfortunately, in the view that I'm using right now, there we go. I'm going to do this. It'll be easier. It'll be faster too. Okay, so this paper is called, where am I? Hello. Paper right here. Paper, Plant Knowledge Transfers Shapes and States in Plant Practices. So I find this really interesting, the way he concluded this paper, because basically the paper goes through, there's just so many things here to look through. I think that there's a number of really interesting aspects that he touches on in this paper, and that most importantly, at least for me, the things that I want kind of to remember about and just the thought process is that he's trying to say that knowledge, the transfer, shaping, and states in plant practices. He basically is saying that in his research and in his experience, there is as much a knowledge-based transfer in the sense of like, I teach you this thing, right? There is, I show you this thing. I show you how to do it, whether that's because you are a child and you follow me around, or whether that is because you have been taught in some ways, this happens. But that is not the whole story to the transfer of knowledge. True transfer of knowledge comes from the relationship with the plants themselves. And therefore, although there are mechanisms that are happening between generations and even within generations, and it is important to experience those plants, that the true transfer of knowledge comes from the direct rapport with the plants, and therefore can be lost when that rapport from the plants. And this part of it I find really interesting. And I find that it's interesting that he says that because of the way that this information arrives, because it's not about dissecting a plant, because it's not about doing tests in order for the knowledge to transfer, it is considered in some ways a form of magic. Because from a Rastafarian perspective, it would be the opening of my sensory spaces, right? Or as I would put it in using my vocabulary, it's the reawakening of your plantness, which allows you to then reconnect in with the plants and receive information in a completely different way. So I see this. I mean, I see this conversation. I see it as really interesting and why they would call it magic. What do you think? How do you see this? I mean, I'm so curious as to what you encounter with this paper. And I just really love to hear what your thoughts about it. So of course, you can always leave me a comment here, but the best place for us to have this conversation is really the Naturally Conscious community, which of course I'll put the recording there too. But this is also the place where we're having these types of experiences, not just conversations about them, but literally these types of experiences that we're talking about. The fact that it is about the relationship with the plants that is causing this deep knowledge transfer. So I'm super curious as to what your thoughts on your experience are relating to this. But, and of course, like I said, the Naturally Conscious community is the place where we can have them. Yeah, another really interesting paper. So thank you all so much for being here. I am really excited that we had the ability to have this conversation. I feel like it's important for us to continue to have these types of conversations because this is exactly where we're getting into a deeper relationship ourselves, right? Papers like this that talks about the fact that knowledge comes through the relationship with the plants reminds us and helps us and enhances us to have these types of conversations on a regular basis. And again, that's the whole reason why the Naturally Conscious community was created, right? We want to have these relationships on a regular basis. And so I invite you to join me over there now. All right, that's it. That's it for another week of Plant Consciousness Commentary. I am so excited to have had you here. I look forward to all of your comments. And if there's anything that you'd like me to review or look at or talk about, you know where to find me. So this is me, Tigre Gardenia. I'm out. Bye.